All right. Good morning, everyone. Looks like we're a little bit limited on time today. Um, I have this quote that I had that I want to just kind of bring up to start things off today. People who operate on good faith often assume others operate on the same good faith. Does anybody like why am I starting with that? Does anybody have any idea?
That's how we get sucked in.
You get sucked in. It happens when they start using the language that we use. We assume that they're meaning the same thing that we're meaning. And I fall into that trap all the time, but that is not true. Hebrew or Matthew 7:15 through 20. This is Jesus. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs or from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Okay, I told you last week we're going to spend a few weeks diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who was not here last week? Okay. It's on YouTube. I just did a overarching introduction to it, okay? So I didn't get into it in very detail. We used some examples. One of the examples that we used was talking about FEMA, and this is how we let off class, and we're not going to get into it today, but just kind of going back, FEMA, instead of going and helping people in need, what is their number one goal?
Diversifying.
Instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. That's their goal. So we talked about that. We talked about how that happens, why that happens, and how prevalent it is in our society, including in our schools that are associated with Churches of Christ. We talked a lot about that. So how do we get here? So here's today. I warned my wife. Now I'm warning you all. Today is a history lesson. It's going to be very different than anything that you've ever experienced probably in a Bible class. The goal of this is not for you to know all these people, because I'm going to go through a bunch of people. The goal coming out of here is for you to connect the dots. So it's going to be overarching. I just need you to connect the dots. Some of these people you're going to be aware of. Some of them you may not. That's fine. It's not about learning who these people are. It's about understanding connecting the dots. Do you know the person on the left?
Greatest player ever.
Do you know the person on the right? Which one of these men has been more influential in our lives?
Must be the one on the right, or you would bring him up.
Depends.
The other reason I bring this up is, and I'm going to get into who this is. The other reason I bring this up is this is a German philosopher. In his time, 17th, 18th century, these were the Michael Jordans of their age. These were the most famous people of their time. We don't think of it like that. We don't think of philosophers in America as the most famous people. We think of the Michael Jordans, the Kardashians. The philosophers, the German philosophers especially, were the most famous people of their time. So this is George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He was 1770 to 1831. Okay, this is the first dot. I could have gone back farther. We've talked about this before. I could have gone back farther, but this is the first dot we're going to start with. Connect the dots. He had what is called the Hegelian dialectic. Now, there's three parts to this. Dialectic is usually you think of it as two parts to it. This one has the third part. You start with a thesis, and the thesis could be also substituted with normal or what we experience today. You can replace that with anything. It's very, very high level. This is the initial proposition or idea that a statement of being or concept. It represents an existing state or point of view. Then you go to an antithesis. This is the negation or contradiction of the thesis. So this is the opposite. It represents opposition to conflict or conflict where the thesis faces a challenge or critique. Synthesis is the resolution of the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis. So, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So how does this work? Okay, you start here, you have a thesis. You have an antithesis, and they battle. You wrestle through it, whether it's an idea, it doesn't matter what it is. Remember, philosophically speaking, this is just, there's nothing hard about this. It's all in your brain, okay? You have two things. You cannot have a thesis without having an antithesis. There's always an antithesis. That's his conclusion. They battle it out. What do you get after you battle it out? You get a synthesis. It's something new that came from both the thesis and the antithesis. Then what happens to the synthesis? What does it become?
New thesis.
It becomes your new thesis. Does the cycle ever end?
No.
It never ends. Which is the next thing about Hegel I want you to hear. I'm just going to go to the second paragraph there. The dialectic helps in understanding concepts not as a static, but as dynamic entities that evolve through contradiction and resolution. For Hegel, truth is found in the process of continual unfolding, not in static assertions. What does this sound like? We've talked about it before.
There's no truth.
Yeah.
Which is what is the name that we call that? Postmodernism. Postmodernism says there is no absolute truth. Where do you think they start to get this stuff from? It's a Hegelian concept. Okay? God, in Hegel's philosophy, is not a static being, but becomes fully actualized through the dialectical process of history. History is the unfolding of God's self-consciousness, where human actions and historical events are part of this divine process. In other words, God is not a being, but rather is always in a state of becoming. No absolute truth. Things are always evolving, always changing. So fluidity, spectrums. This is all stuff comes from Hegel, okay? So, Hegel's the first dot. Why do I bring him up? Why do I start with him? His dialectic influenced later thinkers like Karl Marx, who adapted it into his theory of historical materialism, often called Marxist dialectics. Marx focused on the material condition and class struggle rather than Hegel's more abstract, idealistic approach. In other words, Marx even said he flipped it on its head. So he was a student, if you will, of Hegel, but he flipped it on its head. He says, no. This isn't theoretical. This is practical. Like, we need to actually do this materially speaking. And so he flipped it on its head. And so also it says in contemporary thought, the dialectic appears in various forms in critical theory. We've talked about that. Psychoanalysis, and even some approaches to science and art where the change in development is seen as emerging from inherent contradictions. Okay, second dot. Connect the dots. Now this is the big dot. The real big dot. He's the big bad guy in the room, right? So Marx was born in 1818. His dialectical materialism, his theory of history, and his critique of capitalism all come from Hegel's influence. However, Marx applied it through his materialistic, atheistic, and revolutionary perspective. So Marx didn't buy into the ever-evolving God piece. He was pretty much straight up an atheist. He didn't get into that kind of stuff. Whereas Hegel did give a little bit of that to, there's some sort of a deity out there. So Marx used Hegel's dialectic framework, but filled it in with new content focused on economic and social realities rather than abstract ideas or spiritual development. Both Hegel and Marx saw history as having a direction or purpose. For Hegel, this was unfolding the absolute spirit or idea. For Marx, however, he saw this as a progression towards communism through class struggle. Hegel saw philosophical reflection as a form of revolution in consciousness. Marx turned this into the call for actual material revolution through the proletariat to overthrow capitalism. In other words, Marx is like, let's stop talking about it, let's do it, is another way of saying it. This is the last on Marx. I mean, we talk about him a lot, but his name is on all this stuff, right? So he was all about class struggle. You know, he started the Communist Manifesto with literally, I think it's like the second sentence, history is a history of class struggles between the oppressors and oppressed. And he starts the whole thing with that. Like, that's where he's coming from. That is his perspective. Remember, collectivism thinking. Everybody's a part of a group. Either you're a part of an oppressed group or an oppressor group. Period. That's it. That's how he thought. And for him, it was very much economic driven. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie, rich, power. Proletariat, poor, no power. He called for the abolition of private property. Why did he call for the abolition of private property? What was his moral goal by doing so?
Equality, giving everyone equal status.
Right. Because property was deemed to be the thing that caused people to be better than others. It's what raised you in society. And so if you were able to remove the capital or the property from those people, you could then level the playing field and you could have one flat hierarchy. Abolition of the family. Does anybody know why he wanted to get rid of the family?
Because then you can't inherit.
Yes. So he actually specifies, he gets a little bit more detailed in the Communist Manifesto, and he says, I'm not actually saying that the children of the proletariat need to be taken away, but 100% those of the bourgeoisie need to be taken away and given to the state. At the time that they're no longer needed for to be reared up by their mother. Like, so we're talking young children that they would want. This was his idea, right? This is what he wanted to do. Revolution is necessary and violence is unavoidable. He says in the Communist Manifesto, I wish violence didn't have to be a part of this, but it will have to be. And communism is the goal. I didn't put it in here, but socialism is the way to get to communism. So you start with a socialist society because we're all social beings. The goal is to get to communism. That was what he had put in the Communist Manifesto. Anybody remember how he ends the whole thing? Workers of the world unite. I forget, and then he says, for we have nothing to lose but our chains and the whole world to gain, or something. I'm paraphrasing there, but something like that. Okay. Most of you, I'm sure, know who this guy is. Vladimir Lenin. What's he famous for?
Communist Party, Soviet Union.
He started the Soviet Union. Okay. 1917 was the revolution that started the Soviet Union. And Lenin, this was a power overthrow. They literally went in and did a physical overthrow of the government. And they named him leader. Lenin, like Marx, viewed history as driven by class conflict, particularly between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. He saw the resolution of these conflicts leading towards socialism and eventually communism. Same thing Marx talked about. He embraced Marx's idea that after the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie, there would be, I love this, there would be a transitional phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat before reaching a classless society. So hey, we want to have this perfect utopia where everyone's equal. But before we get there, I just want you guys to know that I'm going to have to be above all you.
Because I'm right.
Yeah. And I'm probably going to have some people under me who are going to rule over other people, but eventually we'll flatten this out. Eventually we'll get there, I promise. He's known for the Red Terror. He initiated it in 1918 after he took power. It was a campaign of political repression and executions. So anybody that disagreed with him, he just would kill you. It was probably between 10,000 to over 100,000 victims. The numbers of deaths, and I'm about to show you more, are super vague because they didn't keep track of the numbers. So you kind of have to make some assumptions on some of these things. So historians are all over the place on what the numbers are actually. Their policies don't work either. And so because their policies don't work, there was famine. They just, the way that they did things, they took away people that had knowledge of how to farm, and they put in people who just were communists first, didn't know what they were doing, and that's what caused famines. So they would kill lots of people. So they estimate between 3 and 5 million people died because of famine, directly related to the fact that they didn't know what they were doing when they were farming. Who took over for Lenin? Joseph Stalin. Remember, we're connecting dots right now because we're going to get there. Joseph Stalin took over for Lenin. Why did he take over for Lenin? Because Lenin died he was not in power that long.
He also started veering away from communist ideas. He started, because of the famine, he started veering away from it. The Communist Party actually started.
Yeah, and you raise a good point because a lot of these people, and I have to give credit where credit's due, I have said from the beginning, the reason I'm bringing this up in a church Bible class is because I believe that this is a religion that we're fighting against. And a lot of these people believed in it as a religion. Like they really truly thought they were going to create this utopian society. And then you're right. So then things start, like the famine happened, and they're like, well, maybe we shouldn't do it that way. Maybe we ought to adjust, or maybe
He actually spoke out against Stalin. He was not in favor of Stalin and what he was trying to do, because Lenin started making that veer away from communist policies.
And Stalin, I don't know if it's up there or not. Yeah, I think I did put it in there. Stalin killed a whole lot more people. He was much, much more ruthless than Lenin was. Lenin was more the idealist. Stalin was like the, no, I will be the dictator forever type of guy. So Stalin killed lots and lots of people. Not a good guy, also very much a Marxist. Believed in these ideas. To your point again, Stalin was probably more interested in the power dynamic than he was the idealism of it. Okay. I'm going to take a left turn here, but there's a reason. This is probably one that many of you have never heard of. Antonio Gramsci. At least he's not Russian or German at this point. So he's an Italian Marxist. He was actually put in prison by Mussolini because he didn't agree with him and he criticized him. So Mussolini put him in prison because he was against fascism. During his imprisonment, he wrote all kinds of stuff, 30 notebooks, 3,000 pages of history and analysis. And his prison notebooks are considered highly original contribution to the 20th century political theory. Okay. Before I get into this, because I don't remember if I have it in here, Gramsci was upset that the Russian Revolution was successful, but some of the other revolutions that he was trying to do in other parts of Europe were not. And he couldn't figure out why. Like, why was the Russian Revolution successful, but the others weren't? And so he was trying to figure that out. And I can't remember if I have that in here, but so he came up with this idea of cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is the dominance of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class who shape the culture of that society. The beliefs and explanations, perceptions, values, and mores. so that the worldview of the ruling class becomes the accepted cultural norm. In other words, it's hard to overthrow something when the people in charge won't let you overthrow it, is really what he's saying, because of the way that they've developed the culture below them. As the universal dominant ideology, the ruling class worldview misrepresents the social, political, and economic status quo as natural, inevitable, and perpetual social conditions that benefit every social class rather than as artificial social constructs that benefit only the ruling class. So remember, we talked about social constructs. He's basically just complaining here that they can't infiltrate capitalism, if you will.
And he's saying the reason why is because the ruling class is in their benefit to convince the working class that capitalism is a good thing.
Right.
And to use the cultural norms to do that.
Right. Yep. Okay, I did put it in here. So Gramsci sought to understand how it was that the Russian Revolution had succeeded and yet the European revolutionary movements had failed. He saw this as a result of a fundamental difference between Russia and the Central and Western European societies. In the East, the state was everything. So East-West, you have to remember East-West, this is not perfect, so just go with me, but think of it as East is going to be your collectivist mindset, West is going to be your individualist mindset, okay? So that's not a perfect description, but that's essentially what we're talking about. But in the West, there was a proper relation between the state and civil society, and when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. So Gramsci, true believer, is how do we subvert that? A direct confrontation with the state was insufficient. In other words, you cannot just go at them with arms and people because it won't work. Because the people, well, let's just be honest, the people are prospering and they're not all up in arms about the fact that they're prospering. They're not really suffering the way that they're suffering like they were in Russia. The state had hegemony, it had a legitimacy, and the ruling class's vision of the world shaped people's consciousness as the common sense of that society. Okay, the war of position then is the struggle to gain positions of influence that can develop counter-hegemony for the socialist movement. For Gramsci, it was this that would be the decisive struggle, even though it would, in fact, take place beforehand. So, before you can overthrow society in the West, you have to infiltrate it, okay? So he came up with this thing, war of position versus war of maneuver. The war of position is an intellectual and cultural struggle wherein the anti-capitalist revolutionary creates a proletariat culture whose naive value system counters the cultural hegemony of the bourgeoisie. A lot of fancy words there. He's just doing what I said. He's trying to say, if we put people in positions that are anti-capitalist, eventually we're going to have that trickle down into society. That's really what he's saying. The proletariat culture will increase class consciousness. It's a term that we ought to pay attention to, class consciousness. They use it a lot. Teach revolutionary theory and historical analysis, and thus further develop revolutionary organization among the social classes. The war of maneuver is what they did in Russia. This is just when you just go to battle and you're just fighting. You're just literally trying to take, property and land, and like this is the thing. But so his conclusion is at the bottom paragraph there: after winning the war of position, where you infiltrate, the socialist leaders would then have the necessary political power and popular support to realize the war of maneuver. Then you can actually go to the physical war that he's talking about. But that you have to do that first. Okay? So this is a quote from him. I put this in here to remind you of this is a spiritual battle. They view this as a religion. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. Which, take a pause here in the quote, what is the thing in the West that creates this individualism ideology? Christianity. This is why he doesn't like Christianity. He wants socialism to overthrow it, and he calls it a religion. because he knows that is the reason why he's having such they're having such trouble getting it into the West. So look what he wants to infiltrate. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media. And there's one more that he mentions later. He also mentions law at times too, but it's just this quote that I had. He did mention law. By transforming the consciousness of society. Transforming the consciousness is making the people in society realize that they're being oppressed. That's what he means. Once you make them realize they're oppressed, then you can. Okay. What does this sound like to you? He's building a Trojan horse, is he not? That's what he's doing. I'm going to take an aside right now because it's relevant to today's current world, but this is not connecting the dots. Well, so it kind of is, but this dot would be like way, way out. Joseph Buttigieg. He is a professor of English at the university, or was, at Notre Dame. Joseph Buttigieg is the person responsible for translating Gramsci's writings. Who's Joseph Buttigieg? Pete Buttigieg's dad. He's our current transportation of secretary, or Secretary of Transportation. Excuse me. He also ran for president, and that's him with his husband and their babies that they paid a surrogate mom to carry for them. So this is an aside. I'm not trying to do the whole dots right now, but I thought it was worth mentioning that Gramsci's work was so adored by Joseph Buttigieg that he translated all of them for us into 3 different volumes. And by the way, you can get it on Amazon for $90 if you're interested. During his presidential campaign, someone asked, well, wait a minute, is this really true? Is Pete Buttigieg's father a Marxist who spoke fondly of Communist Manifesto? And I snipped it in there for you. Snopes, who is no conservative outlet, said, yes, this is actually true. He is. So that's who he is, okay? His son is now part of our governing agencies. It's infiltrating, okay? All right, now, that was an aside. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back in time again. Rudi Dutschke. He has one thing that he's most famous for, and that was there's no evidence that he actually knew what Gramsci wrote, but he had the same idea. And so he wrote this thing, and he called it The Long March Through the Institutions. I'm not going to talk about it today, but does anybody know what the Long March, where he gets that? I could have put that in the Connect the Dots today, but I didn't. The Long March. That was Mao. Mao Zedong. I don't know how you say that last name. Mao Zedong. He is the leader of China who started Communist China, who killed probably over 300 million people. Mao, before he became ruler of China, he had to retreat, and they retreated, and it was called the Long March, and it was over 5,000 miles that they had to retreat. And as his army was retreating, they were meeting up with small villages and the peasants, and so they gained a lot of popularity amongst the peasants in China during the Long March. And when they finally got done, and he was able to then confront and physically take over and take power in China, he called that Long March, like that was like their, they were really proud of it. Like it was something that they were proud of. Well, this is what Rudi Dutschke is talking about. He wants to do the Long March through the institutions. What are the institutions?
Or universities and schools.
And churches, and law, and media. This is what he was known for. The next guy seconded that motion. So Herbert Marcuse, he was a friend of Rudi Dutschke. Similar time frame, but they were very much in the same time frame, but they were very much aligned with this. And so Herbert Marcuse said, yes, this is how we need to approach this, the Long March through the institutions. And he went further and said, the way that we do it is we need to take the jobs that are in those areas. We can't just be teaching at universities. We need to get people to go be programmers, to be doctors, like teachers. Like they needed to get people doing the jobs where these things could be propagated. So these are some of his writings. One Dimensional Man is a book. Repressive Tolerance, Essay on Liberation, Counter-Revolution and Revolt. A lot of these were essays that he wrote. Eros and Civilization, that's an interesting one. I definitely can't bring that into a church Bible class. Marxism and feminism. So he was very, very much a hardcore Marxist. And he was also trying to figure out how do we get Marxism in the West, because these darn Christians are so opposed to it and they just won't let us bring it in. Like that was, if I'm summarizing what they thought. We've talked about the Frankfurt School. Marcuse was, I want to say it was in 1953, he took over the Frankfurt School, when we talked about that before, which was basically a neo-Marxist organization that taught, critical theory was the big thing that came out of that school. So he brought on this cultural hegemony, which is similar to what Gramsci was talking about. He believed that in advance of industrial societies, capitalism maintained control, not just through economic power, but through cultural hegemony, shaping desires, needs, and thoughts of the population. He argued that individuals taking up positions in cultural, educational, and media institutions would subtly shift societal consciousness forward a critique of capitalism, which indirectly could align with Marxist thought. He had a term, subversion from within. It's right in the title there. You're trying to get into the institution so you can subvert them. These are some, this is a quote of his. Liberating tolerance, and this is where he takes it to the next level. Liberating tolerance then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and tolerant of movements from the left. Pause. When did we see that happen within the past 4 years? In fact, exactly 4 years ago. Intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left.
You couldn't gather as a church, but you could gather to protest.
Correct. Well, that was part of like the COVID. Like,
right.
You are not allowed to go be with 5 or 10 friends for Thanksgiving, but if you're going to go protest on the street because of racial injustice, all masks are off.
Yeah.
Right.
All masks are off.
Also, there was a riot in it was May, June, July of summer of 2020. Then there was another riot in January of 2021. Only 6 months later. How were they treated?
One was
an insurrection,
justified and the other one was evil. And
We're living this. Intolerance from things that come from the right and toleration from the left. Paulo Freire got his book right here if anybody wants to read it. Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I mean, the title alone tells you where he's coming from. Why do I bring up Paulo? Because he is quite literally the most influential person that affects the way that we teach our kids in public schools today. If they're learning in the classrooms, the way that the teachers are taught to teach the students come from his ideologies. Without getting into it too much, because we're running out of time, he advocated for a problem-posing education where students are encouraged to question, investigate, and challenge rather than passively receiving the information. This is getting a critical mindset in the minds of young children. Now, I don't have necessarily a problem with that, because I think you should be able to question. But you can see where he's trying to take this, right? Dialectic learning, or dialogic learning. Freire emphasized the importance of dialogue between teacher and student. I'll summarize this one for you. This is the teacher coming in and saying to the children, hey, I'm here to learn from you just as much as you're here to learn from me. There's some situations where that is true, and that's usually with an adult environment, but that is not how we should be teaching our kids. We are not here to learn from our kids. Conscientization and social awareness. This is referring to the development of critical awareness in one's social reality through reflection and actions. In schools, this translates to curricula that encourages students to reflect on social issues, inequality, and justice, aiming to empower them to enact change. Education is liberation. His idea that education should be a process of liberation from oppressed has influenced educational movements aimed at empowering marginalized groups, including ethnic minorities, low-income communities, and women, by making education a tool for social justice. So he put out, here's how we need to be teaching students of education in the universities to get them to teach this in their classrooms. So this is where they started. They started this in the 70s and the 80s. And now we're starting to see the fruits of it, because now they're the senior level teachers and it's all coming down. And that's what our students are getting. So this is who he is. He's very influential. You cannot look past people like this. You say, oh, he doesn't mean anything to me. What does he have to do with the church? Well, turns out actually a lot, because a lot of our students, a lot of our kids at this church go to public schools. So if we don't understand who this is, and we don't connect the dots back to how all this comes back from this theory of Marx, the theory of Hegel. So they're bringing in a Trojan horse. They want to bring in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sounds great. I think you have the same intentions as I do. I am not against diversity and inclusivity. Equity, I like that in my home more than I like it in anything else. But you don't mean what I want you to mean. That's what I'm getting at here. So what are they bringing in? And they do this. I add this one just as an aside: social emotional learning. I want my kids to be socially and emotionally taught. Nothing wrong with that if your definition matches my definition. Guess what? It doesn't. I know what you're up to. What they're really bringing in is Marxism. Okay, summary screen. Hegel influenced Marx. And I could have gone beyond Hegel. I didn't. There's Kant. There's Rousseau. Marx was heavily influencing Lenin, Stalin, Gramsci, Deutschke, Marcuse, and Freire. And we've just discussed how all of these have slowly over time infiltrated us in the West by bringing different ideas that sound good to us as Christians, that use our language to try to manipulate us into saying, yes, I want that. That sounds great. Who doesn't want to be inclusive? Why does your marriage between a man and a woman have to exclude everybody else? Like, this is how they manipulate us. I created a second one here because I told you I skipped over it. Mao Zedong. Mao was heavily influenced by Lenin and Stalin. He wanted what they had done. And wow, when you get into what Mao did, it was unbelievable. A few weeks ago, Dale mentioned, he just did a quick about what are they called? Struggle session. Remember you mentioned struggle session? We're going to probably get into that a little bit more, but that comes from Mao. That comes from the Cultural Revolution of China, which is, when you see it and when you hear about it, it's unbelievable what he did. We'll end on this. Sorry. My voice is going out this morning. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you will know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come into the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess that Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and is now in the world already. Little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. They are from the world, therefore they speak from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. Whoever is not from God does not listen to us. By this We know that the Spirit of truth and the Spirit, by this, we know the Spirit of truth and the Spirit of error. So I'll leave that with you. Let's pray real quick and then we'll end. Dear Heavenly Father, we give you thanks, Lord. We want to thank you for this day and thank you for this time that we have. And Lord, we just are earnestly trying to understand how we can combat evil in this world and how we can bring others to you and let them see your light and believe in you and Christianity and your Son as the true religion that saves. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. Thanks, everyone.